This is the story of Israel from Abraham to Jesus. It all starts with God's promise to Abraham that he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. The first of those descendants, Isaac, we don't know much about, but his son Jacob wrestled with God and had his name changed to Israel. Israel had 12 sons, one of those who was Joseph, who went from being a prisoner to being a ruler in Egypt. In Egypt, the children of Israel grew into a mighty nation until Moses led the people out of Egypt towards the promised land. It was Joshua who was the mighty warrior who led the children of Israel in battle to conquer the promised land. And then we get to the time of Judges, and people became more and more and more evil. And that led to the time of the kings, where we find the first king, Saul, who had no heart, the next king, David, who had a full heart, and David's son, Solomon, who had half a heart. Because of that half a heart, the kingdom of Israel was split in two, and split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, called Israel, which had no good kings, and the southern kingdom, called Judah, which had a few kings over time. The prophets of the time began to proclaim to turn back to God. The major prophets wrote big, heavy books. The minor prophets wrote little bitty books, but the message was the same: return your hearts to God. The people didn't listen though, and eventually the Assyrians came and captured Israel, and the northern kingdom was dispersed over all of Assyria. For over 100 years, prophets continued to tell Judah to stop what they were doing and turn to God, but they didn't listen. So the Babylonians came in and captured Judah, and then the Persians came in and captured Babylon. But then the people of Judah were allowed to return. They began to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. Through all this time, the prophets looked forward and looked ahead to a hope that was coming. And then for 400 years, God was silent. That is until he began to speak again about a baby who was coming. And that's a very condensed version of the history of Israel from Abraham to Jesus. We're studying this on Sunday nights, where we're taking some time to go deep into some of the stories we may not study as often during that time period. So we really hope you will join us then. I also want to say one quick disclaimer. Back in college, in 92 or 93-ish, I did something called the Walk Through the Old Testament. I went through a seminar with this, and the idea of having hand motions to walk through the Old Testament came from them. I don't really remember much of it. I think the half heart, no heart, whole heart thing, I'm almost 100% sure that came from them. But the rest of it is just stuff that I kind of came up with as I was walking through this thing. But I do want to shout out to them. And if you see anything like that, definitely go grab it. Awesome resource to be a part of.